Try to put yourself in early modern Europe around the 17th, 18th centuries. In many small villages in Eastern Europe, especially Poland, Hungary, or the Balkan region, villagers often faced a strange obsession: corpses in graves that did not decompose for many months. Instead of decaying as usual, the bodies remained intact with dark red lips, as if stained with blood. With limited medical knowledge, the people were convinced that this was the sign of a vampire. Rumors spread quickly the dead did not rest in peace, but had returned to drink the blood of the living. When a plague crop failure or unusual death occurred in the village, suspicion immediately fell on the dead who refused to leave. The villagers would dig up graves, drive stakes through hearts, and even burn the corpses, rituals believed to be the only way to protect the community from the shadow of the vampire. Imagine you are a peasant from that time. In the middle of a cold winter night, you hear whispers at the church. In old Ivan's grave, the body is still intact. It must be a vampire. Would you be skeptical, awaiting the birth of science? Or would you also be terrified, believing that death is never the end? It was from these very real obsessions that the image of the vampire not only existed in legends, but also became a part of life, weaving its way into every village in early modern Europe. Early modern Europe, from the 17th to the 18th century, was a period of great turmoil. This was a time when poor and isolated rural areas were still shrouded by disease, famine, and war. Medicine was undeveloped, science was in its infancy, and the majority of the population lived by faith tradition and the teachings of the church. In this context, any unusual phenomenon surrounding death was easily attributed to the supernatural. In many parts of Eastern Europe, especially Transylvania, Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans, people maintained very strict burial customs. A body that did not decompose, a trace of blood flowing from a dead person's mouth, or sounds coming from underground, were all considered evidence of a vampire. In reality, many of these cases can be explained by medical phenomena: slow decomposition in cold conditions, gas buildup causing the body to bloat, or blood and fluids being expelled due to pressure during decomposition. But to the people of that time, this was irrefutable proof that the dead had not rested in peace. Furthermore, epidemics from the plague and cholera to tuberculosis spread death throughout the villages. When many people died in succession, the community often attributed the cause to a vampire that had just emerged from its grave to spread disease. This fear led villagers to adopt a series of gruesome rituals: digging up graves to check, driving stakes through hearts, beheading, or sprinkling lime and ash on the bodies. These were not just superstitious acts, but a way for the community to reassure itself during times of crisis. It was in this context of anxiety and instability that the image of the vampire was not purely a product of imagination, but a direct result of a lack of scientific understanding, combined with the overwhelming fear of disease and death that gripped early modern Europe. When thinking of vampires in early modern Europe, many people immediately think of Transylvania, a region linked to the legend of Count Dracula. But before novels and romantic literature glamorized this figure, the fear of vampires was deeply ingrained in the daily life of Eastern European peasants. It was not just a story told by the fireside, but was also recorded in chronicles, court records, and even the newspapers of the time. Undecomposed bodies, the seeds of obsession. One of the direct origins of the belief in vampires was the strange condition of bodies in their graves. Many reports from the 17th and 18th centuries describe corpses remaining almost intact for months. In Poland, a body was once exhumed that still had dark blood around its mouth, its hair and beard had grown longer, and its fingernails were as hard as if it were still alive. The villagers saw this as a sign that the deceased had been drinking blood at night to sustain itself. In reality, modern medicine can explain this phenomenon in cold, dry soil conditions. The decomposition process is slow, making the body appear intact. The shrinking of the skin can expose teeth and nails, creating the illusion that hair, beard, and nails have grown longer. But in the eyes of a 17th century peasant, this was all proof of a vampire's presence. The case of Medveja, Serbia, 1732. A famous incident occurred in the village of Medveja, Serbia in 1732. The story revolves around a man named Arnold Paule, a former soldier who claimed to have been bitten by a vampire while he was alive. After his death, villagers witnessed a series of unusual deaths and suspected that Powell had returned to haunt them. They dug up his grave and recorded that Powell's body was still intact, with fresh blood flowing from his mouth. Immediately, the villagers drove a stake through his heart, beheaded him, and burned the body. This story did not just remain a local rumor. The Habsburg army sent doctors and officers to investigate. The official report, which detailed the exhumation and handling of the corpse, was then circulated throughout Europe. This was one of the first vampire crazes, sparking fierce debate among both intellectuals and common people about the existence of these creatures. Plague and vampires. Another important factor that reinforced the belief in vampires was disease. When tuberculosis spread, patients often became emaciated, coughed up blood, and died a slow, painful death. To the people of that time, these symptoms looked exactly like a vampire was sucking their blood from the inside. Families with a sick member were often rumored to be afflicted by a vampire, and the graves of their relatives were likely to be dug up for inspection. In Poland, archaeologists have discovered many anti-vampire graves bodies buried with their heads reversed or with a sickle placed across their neck to prevent them from rising again. These graves show that the obsession was not just a rumor, but had become an actual burial custom. From folk rituals to church intervention, initially vampire-slaying rituals were confined to folklore, digging up graves, driving stakes, and burning bodies. But gradually, the government and the church were also drawn in. Many priests had to participate in exorcisms in cemeteries, reading from the Bible, while villagers dealt with the corpses using shovels and picks. In some places, the church even issued official guidelines to distinguish between a natural death and a vampire. However, not everyone agreed. Some Enlightenment intellectuals began to object, arguing that this was merely a product of ignorance, but the voice of reason was often not strong enough to overcome the deep-seated fear. A single rumor spreading through a village was enough to make the entire community act as if it were an established fact. Spreading across Europe, these vampire hunts were not limited to the Balkans. They quickly spread to Germany, France, and even England. European newspapers in the 18th century frequently published bizarre stories about exhumed graves. The vampire obsession became a social phenomenon discussed by both commoners and academics. Writers, poets, and later novelists transformed these real incidents into artistic material. From there, the vampire gradually shed its role as a rural nightmare to enter popular culture, becoming an immortal figure in literature and art. Part truth, part fear. Looking back, we can see that the vampire of early modern Europe was not just a mythical character. Behind it lay very real fears, the fear of disease, of unexplained death, and of helplessness in the face of nature. Every dug-up grave, every stake driven through a corpse's chest reflected how a community defended itself against things it could not understand. This obsession lasted for centuries, leaving its mark on burial rituals, historical documents, and collective memory. It laid the foundation for the image of the vampire today, from the undecomposed corpses in Eastern European villages to the romantic and enchanting characters on the silver screen. The belief in vampires did not stop at rumors or folk rituals. It quickly became a social phenomenon, leading to a series of profound consequences in the community life of early modern Europe. Mass hysteria and ritual violence. When a rumor about a vampire in a village spread, the entire community would fall into a state of panic. People were afraid to go out at night, children were kept indoors, and the sick were viewed with suspicion. Numerous graves were dug up just to prove the existence of a supernatural culprit. These actions were in fact a form of ritual violence. Bodies were staked, beheaded, and burned, which not only hurt the families of the deceased, but also increased tension within the community. In many places, whenever there was an epidemic or an unusual death, villagers would find a way to blame a vampire. This created a cycle of fear. The more misfortunes that occurred, the more graves were exhumed, and the wider the obsession spread. The church and intellectuals. A challenged belief faced with the power of this wave of superstition, the Catholic and Orthodox churches were forced to intervene. Many priests accompanied villagers during exorcisms, reading from the Bible by the graveside. But there were also officials who considered it a heresy, contrary to doctrine. This division reflected a larger debate in European society: should vampires be seen as a supernatural phenomenon or as a mistake born of ignorance? The 18th century was also the period of the Enlightenment, which was spreading across Europe. Many scholars, doctors, and philosophers spoke out against it, arguing that vampires were merely products of imagination and misinterpretations of corpses. Some articles and medical essays tried to offer logical explanations, slow decomposition tuberculosis, or even cases of premature burial due to poor medical diagnosis. But reason was never strong enough to extinguish the fear that had become deeply rooted in the minds of the villagers. The press and cross-border transmission. A unique aspect of the 18th century vampire craze was the role of the press. Incidents in Serbia, Poland, or Hungary were often recorded and reprinted in major cities like Vienna, Paris, and London. Newspapers described in detail the scenes of grave digging, perfectly preserved corpses, and the ritual of driving a stake through the heart. As a result, the fear of vampires was not confined to small villages, but spread throughout Europe, becoming a topic of public debate. This created an interesting contrast. In the cities, the intellectual class read these reports as curiosities, discussing them in coffee houses or academies. Whereas in the countryside, they were seen as proof that what they had long believed was true. Long-term cultural impact. Although gradually refuted by science, the image of the vampire left a deep and lasting mark. It became a symbol of the fear of death, of social anxiety, and of humanity's attempt to explain what it could not understand. In the 19th century, as Romantic and Gothic literature developed, the vampire was reborn on the page, from short stories in Germany and France to Bram Stoker's masterpiece, Dracula, at the end of the century. From a folk phenomenon, the vampire fully entered popular culture, living on forever in the human imagination. The debate resonates to this day. Even today, when archaeologists find anti-vampire graves in Poland or Italy, it still causes a stir. It reminds us that collective fear can turn into concrete actions, leaving a mark for hundreds of years. The question remains, were those who believed in vampires at that time merely victims of ignorance, or did they truly experience something beyond modern comprehension? Today, when we think of vampires, we often think of Hollywood movies, romantic novels, or mesmerizing figures in popular culture. But few know that behind this magical veil lies a period of great anxiety in early modern Europe, a place where people truly believed that death was never the end. The exhumed graves, the stakes through hearts, and the anti-vampire rituals were not just myths. They are testaments to collective fear at a time when science was not yet able to provide answers, and people had to rely on belief for self-assurance. It was this fear that helped shape one of the most powerful symbols in world culture. And looking back, we can see that whether vampires were real or not, their ghost still exists in our lives today. It reminds us that ignorance combined with anxiety and rumor can create myths powerful enough to dominate an entire society. So what do you think? Were the people of 17th century Eastern Europe just victims of superstition, or did they touch upon a part of reality that we have yet to discover? Leave your thoughts and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to explore more mysteries in history.